Imagine a world where our digital interactions are rich, they're immersive, they're as real as our physical ones. In this world, we work, we play, we interact in a fully digital universe that transcends the traditional boundaries of space and time. This world is not really a product of science fiction anymore. It's called the metaverse. My name is Arno Veer. I'm the author of the book on cybersecurity, how non-technical corporate leaders and boards can manage in a scary digital world. I've got over 20 years experience in cybersecurity, and I consider myself an expert on the topic. Today, I'll be talking to you about securing the metaverse, the intersection of the metaverse and cybersecurity. So to give you a brief overview of the topics that I'll be covering, firstly is just to address traditional cybersecurity. Ultimately, any advanced technology is still resting on a foundation of what we call traditional compute, and that then requires traditional cybersecurity. Next, I'll go through specifically some of the aspects to consider when looking at metaverse cybersecurity, and then three specific topics which really are unique or at least have an interesting dimension in the metaverse. That means digital identities, digital assets, and then finally, laws and regulations. So let's jump straight in. Firstly, looking at traditional cybersecurity. Now, when I say traditional cybersecurity, I don't mean boring cybersecurity because it's absolutely not the case, but rather how do we today secure the environments that we have? So when you look at a corporate environment, cybersecurity always relies on securing hardware. So that's addressing risks at the hardware layer. And that's typically things like buying from reputable vendors and ensuring firmware updates and upgrades. So there's various risks at the hardware layer. Next, we look at networks. That's interconnectivity of devices. And there we have technologies in place to secure the networks, to secure those communications. Next is the operating system. So any computing environment relies on a set of operating systems, and those need to be secured, those need to be patched. Next, we look at databases where the data is stored, and this is where things like encryption, patching of databases becomes very important. And then finally, software. So that's everything from developing secure software, but also ensuring vulnerability management, looking for vulnerabilities and addressing vulnerabilities. So this is what I call a traditional computer environment and a traditional IT environment. And within most organizations today, a significant amount of money is already invested and spent on securing these environments. As we pivot towards the future, where the metaverse is one of the technologies, but we also have other things like AI, like robotics, all the buzzwords that we hear. But as we pivot to that new future or to the future technologies, these fundamentals will still exist. So it's important to recognize that these controls and traditional cybersecurity that has matured over the years is as fundamental today as it will be when we move into new technologies. But I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's nothing unique here other than we need to continue to do the same things that we've already done within these spaces. And don't get me wrong, there are significant challenges in traditional cybersecurity for standard working environments. But as we move into the metaverse, cybersecurity takes on a whole new dimension. There are new things to consider. Firstly, and I cheekily enough did bring a prop. I thought it would be appropriate in a metaverse discussion to show you at least that I've got a VR headset. But the headsets are really the vehicle, the mechanism, the way, the hardware that gets us into the metaverse. And with that, we'll have a whole slew of risks. So that is, who is the manufacturer? Is it a reputable vendor? Where is the device manufactured? And then, of course, as with all hardware type products, it's incumbent on the user to ensure that the device is updated periodically. And I can guarantee that VR headsets will need to be updated. The question is whether users have educated themselves and are aware of these kind of risks. So with Metaverse, we add a new component, and that new component comes with its own unique set of challenges and risks. Some of these are vulnerabilities, and hardware vulnerabilities are not new to the industry. Historically, we've found chipsets that suddenly have vulnerabilities that are being exploited by researchers and then later on hackers, but also devices of this caliber which are able to store and process data at an unprecedented level. The question is, how is that data secured? Where is that data sent to? And then most importantly, how does that data get encrypted? Once we move past the hardware layer and we go down to the software layer or the virtual worlds, there's a question of how do you ensure that the virtual world that you're entering is the correct one? How do you know? Already on mobile phones, we see a proliferation of fake applications, applications pretending to be a legitimate company but not being so. On the internet as well, you see malicious websites, websites that are masquerading as legitimate companies. So I fully expect that as we enter into the metaverse and use it more and more in our daily lives, that the trustworthy of the virtual worlds will become more and more of an important consideration. And then as we enter those virtual worlds and legitimize those, how do we ensure that the spaces we are visiting are legitimate, that those haven't been constructed by someone with malicious intent? How do we know that the brands that are on the virtual spaces are legitimate? What about things like IP, brand theft? These are all things that we'll need to consider as we enter into this new exciting world. Next, digital identities. So here we talk about avatars and how you represent yourself in the virtual world, in the metaverse. More than likely, we'll have various avatars. So today you have your own persona. In the metaverse, you can be various personas. You can have your game persona. So who are you in Fortnite, as an example? My sister, comically enough, is a banana, and that is a possibility in the metaverse. And then, of course, when you look at your work persona, who would you represent there? Maybe you put a little more hair on your head. Perhaps you make yourself slightly younger. Who knows? I'm sure vanity will creep into the mix. But indeed, there's consideration around how do you represent yourself in the metaverse and what does your avatar look like? But more importantly, how do we protect that? Now, one of the scary elements of the metaverse and these hardware devices is just the sheer amount of biometric data, user data that's captured by the VR devices. This is unprecedented. In the past, of course, we already have online data being exfiltrated, data being gathered by brokers, by companies, and then monetized and sold on. But with VR, the amount of data is at a whole new level. And this becomes much more personal because it's your voice, it's your iris, it's your face, and then later on, your space. So the level of data is extreme. And that's going to pose challenges to companies. How do you ensure, for example, that identities aren't stolen, that fake accounts aren't created, that bots aren't created? If the current social media landscape is anything to go by, I think we can conclude that these will become a problem. And right now, with generative AI and the capabilities that you're able to very easily do, creating deep fakes and imposters has become more or less commoditized. So these are things that we'll have to grapple with. And then, of course, how do we deal with inappropriate user actions, which today we already see significant amounts of on social media, for example? So what's the recourse when someone behaves inappropriately, either in a social metaverse or even a corporate metaverse? What about abusive content? Who moderates that? Who decides that what is appropriate, what is not appropriate? These are the kind of questions, these are the kind of issues that we'll face, that we'll need to deal with. Moving on to digital assets, and this is one of the fundamentals of a virtual environment, is, of course, a digital asset is ultimately just data representation. So how is data collected? How's it stored? Is it stored on the device? Is it stored in a wallet? How is it encrypted? Then with the payment technologies underlying the metaverse, and you already have in many of the metaverses unique currencies for those metaverses. So payments are going to be an issue, something to deal with. And then non-fungible tokens, which represents the ownership and the legitimacy of a digital product. These are fairly nascent technologies. I see the usage increasing in the metaverse. And with those, of course, like with anything digital, come some of the risks. So there's risks, for example, to NFT and cryptocurrency exchanges. How do you know that you're on a legitimate exchange? How do you know that the exchange is being protected? There are various issues that will come up in terms of not only procuring, but also storing and exchanging or dealing in digital assets. Crypto wallets is a form where you can take your digital asset, remove it from an online exchange and put it into a cold storage. But those have risks too. So mostly can get stolen, but those devices also can be hacked, as with all technology. So there's some interesting things to consider there. And then, of course, with all of these digital assets, there are various scams that have already taken place. Fake NFTs, cryptocurrency exchanges that have been faked, various risks, cybersecurity risks and considerations. So as you enter into that world and deal in digital assets, securing those become important. And then finally, laws and regulations. So basically, right now we have inconsistent regulations globally. Data privacy, the GDPR in the EU, is a fairly advanced and sometimes seen as prohibitive data privacy laws, but that is at odds with in the US that doesn't have a data privacy law for the whole country. And those laws, data privacy being one of the many, will need to be expanded for the metaverse. Other laws, things like intellectual property, copyright, amongst others, are going to need to be changed. They need to be updated to address. Then with metaverse, the amount of data is massive. And of course, now you see some countries with data localization laws. So that means storing data of those citizens in that country. And in a fully immersive virtual world, this becomes a challenge. Who's the vendor? Who's storing the data? Where are they storing that? So I see data localization laws are going to be very challenging. And then finally, right now, there's not really adequate laws around digital assets and cryptocurrencies. You're starting to see some whispers of them. And AI regulations also are relatively nascent. The EU is making some noise there, and I expect some regulation relatively shortly. But again, these are not global in nature. And so that's going to be one of the major challenges with the metaverse. And then finally, everyone's favorite topic, and that is app permissions and user agreements. So we all know when using and buying a new fancy piece of technology, probably the last thing you do is read the user agreements. And I think on purpose, many of the providers make those user agreements rather cumbersome. I think it's on purpose so that we don't read them. But I do think as you move into the metaverse, as you start using these technologies, it's good to understand what are you agreeing to? What are you signing up for? If you're going to download applications and use applications on your devices, what are the permissions that you've been allowed? And there, to me, the trustworthiness of the vendor who creates the product is something that we will all need to consider as we move forward. My name is Arno Veer. That is my talk on the metaverse and securing the metaverse. It's quick. It's just the tip of the iceberg. If you want to know more, you can find my book on Amazon, but also you can go to the website, bookoncybersecurity.com. You can reach out to me. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And if you'd like to get a copy of my book, very happy for you to do so. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and good luck in the metaverse.